In a moment now, Dr. Fernando Segovia will be talking to us of an ethic and a theology of reversal in Luke Acts. We've seen it before. Let's look at it again in the Song of Mary, the Magnificat. The Almighty has used the power of His arm. He has routed the arrogant of heart. He has pulled down princes from their thrones and raised high the lowly. He has filled the starving with good things, sent the rich away empty. He has come to the help of Israel, His servant, mindful of His faithful love, according to the promise He made to our ancestors. The promise to the ancestors was the blessing of the families of the earth. That's all right. But it's the theology of reversal that brings on the despising of Jesus' goodness then and now. A lot of us then and now who find the status quo rather to our liking are troubled by these fiercely, for us, negative beatitudes. But alas for you who are rich, you're having your consolation now. Alas for you who have plenty to eat now, you shall go hungry. Alas for you who are laughing now, you shall mourn and weep.
The passages from Luke Acts for this session reveal several fundamental dimensions of the early Christian movement, both with regard to the ministry of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus' disciples after His death. First, the author of Luke Acts depicts a Jesus who is unceasingly engaged in teaching and great deeds. Second, the author further portrays a Jesus who defines His own role as one of reaching out to social outcasts and who functions as a severe and unrelenting social critic. Finally, the author also describes the consequences of this twofold role: amazement, praise, and acceptance, to be sure, but also intense opposition and persecution. Again, this complex portrayal of Jesus' ministry in the Gospel is directly paralleled by the portrayal of the disciples' own ministry of teaching and great deeds in the book of Acts. For contemporary Christian believers and readers of Luke Acts, living in a very different type of society and in a very different kind of church, these fundamental dimensions of the early Christian movement depicted in Luke Acts raise serious and troubling questions. In effect, to what extent is this early parallelism between Jesus and His disciples to be extended to our own day and time, to our own lives as disciples of Jesus? The first dimension of the ministry is unmistakable to the reader. Teaching and great deeds lie at its very core. From the moment the ministry begins, in His own synagogue at Nazareth, Jesus is portrayed as teaching everywhere, from village to village and from synagogue to synagogue, as well as performing great deeds throughout, both healings and exorcisms. Such a ministry is open and public. While the teaching is received as uniquely authoritative, the deeds are perceived as immensely powerful. In fact, teaching and deeds reinforce one another. The character of the deeds is properly grounded in the very nature of the teaching, and the authority of the teaching is directly enhanced by the power of the deeds. Similarly, after receiving the promised Spirit, Jesus' disciples begin to duplicate His teaching and deeds quite openly and publicly as well. The public life of both Jesus and the disciples is characterized, therefore, by constant teaching and powerful deeds. The second dimension of the ministry is quite clear as well. Its task is to reach out as widely as possible and to call into question as much as possible. The role of Jesus that emerges through such teaching and great deeds is not one of social reinforcement and acceptance, but rather one of defiance and social critique. In fact, the nature of the ministry is described from the very first in terms of a very different kind of audience altogether. As the scene in the synagogue of Nazareth defines it, the ministry will be directed in particular to social outcasts and outsiders, to the poor, the blind and the lame, the oppressed, the alien. The ministry is presented as very much inclusive, therefore. As such, the ministry not only bypasses, but also attacks established social and religious conventions. With the preaching of God's kingdom, such laws and customs yield to the search for sinners, for the outcast and the outsider. In fact, through the ministry of Jesus, the fundamental values of society are reversed. While the honorable and socially acceptable spurn the call, the shameful and socially excluded come to Jesus. Through the ministry, furthermore, the very concept of election itself is reversed. While the chosen reject the call, an invitation is extended to the Gentile outsiders. Exactly the same pattern of reaching out and criticizing may be observed at work in the ministry of the disciples. The third dimension of the ministry is also unmistakable to the reader. Its consequences involve both acceptance and rejection. Again, the scene at the Nazareth synagogue is programmatic. On the one hand, Jesus' teaching and great deeds meet with approval and amazement, so that his fame spreads everywhere and people seek him out from all quarters. At the same time, his ministry does attract a number of sustained followers, of disciples and apostles, who leave behind their established way of life to become fishers of human beings. On the other hand, Jesus' ministry also encounters anger and indignation, objections and accusations, calls for proof of authority and the planting of spies, violent rejection and plots to eliminate him. The more the ministry unfolds, the greater the resistance from those who hold positions of power, from the honorable and the socially acceptable. The same twofold reaction may be observed with regard to the disciples' own ministry. On the one hand, approval, amazement, and more disciples. On the other, threats, imprisonment, violent rejection, and plots to eliminate them. For present-day readers in the mainline churches living in a post-industrial society, this portrayal of the early Christian movement in Luke Acts is bound to appear, upon close reading and serious reflection, rather curious and problematic. First, not only are such great deeds entirely absent from these churches, but also perceived as quite suspect in those churches where they do take place. Similarly, teaching is by no means unceasing, insofar as religion has become but one aspect of a very complex daily life. Second, the role of social defiance and critique is largely missing from the vision of these churches. In fact, if anything, social acceptance and reinforcement have become the norm. Finally, while approval and growth are considered worthy goals, any type of opposition is looked upon as offensive and to be avoided at all costs. Thus, while no doubt admiring the radical determination of Jesus and his disciples, contemporary readers are likely to look upon a similar determination in their own lives as quite foolhardy and counterproductive. Yet for serious and reflective readers, the question is bound to persist. Does this vision of Luke Acts have anything to say to our own day and time? Perhaps one way to begin formulating a proper response is to look at our own lives and society today. Do we still find the poor, the lame and the blind, the oppressed and the alien? Do we look down upon such people or blame them for their problems while thanking God for our own blessings? Do we see injustice in the name of justice and abuse in the name of freedom, evil in the name of good? Do we tend to look the other way and follow our own path, asking no questions and minding our own business? Removed as it is from our time and culture, Luke Acts does provide us with a serious and troubling challenge. Our response must be open and explicit. The consequences are enormous for our lives as Christian believers, our teaching, and our deeds.
We've just heard these words. In fact, through the ministry of Jesus, the fundamental values of society are reversed. Later in our study, we'll see Paul and his company threatened by a mob accusing them of trying to turn the world upside down. Let me leave us with a question now. If his goodness was despised, as clearly it was for Jesus and his disciples, what about us who aspire to be disciples? Will we find ourselves despised for proclaiming and implementing the goodness of the gospel of Jesus Christ?